So welcome back, everyone. Most of you are back anyway.
Some chickens, so I think that's a good sign.
Today is now what? I think we spent way too much time last week on the 19th century, but it felt like something we had to do. And I want to spend most of the time having the room talk, not me talk today, about where do we go next as the congregation. But before we do that, are there any reflections or thoughts? I didn't give a lot of time for people to have input last week because I was racing through many, many years. Are there reflections or comments or things a week later that people wanted to bring up from last week? Yes.
Well, for me, one of the things is also during lunch I ended up watching a lot of science documentaries, and one of the things I was thinking of last week is this is something that's happened many times in history. It's not just us one time. I always feel awkward mentioning evolution in a church, but there was one documentary that talked about how it's like we wiped out the Neanderthals, basically, and they always show that parallel with how us as Europeans wiped out we didn't wipe out I'll say indigenous for now, First Nations, that was the term, whatever we label them as, but it's just a long history that not just us as Christians, but that people have done. Like another one that comes to mind was Roman pagans. Even before Christian missionaries got to Europe, Roman pagans had done a lot of terrible things to the European pagans.
Yeah, it's definitely a human story, and I think what's interesting to me anyway, thinking what are we going to do in the 21st century is, are we trying to rewrite, or are we trying to progress as a human species and say, let's take some accountability for the actions that we are benefiting from? And that's probably happened in the past too, but I think it's an interesting question. Are there other thoughts or reflections or what have you? Okay. Thank you, Laura. She sent me something yesterday. I don't think this was her intent, but I wanted to run with it. Vine Deloria is a Lakota person, if I'm not mistaken, who has done a lot of writing about his people and his people in relation with the United States. And I thought this would be a useful caution as we embark on these conversations. Because we flooded the room with a lot of knowledge last week, and we're all of highly educated people who think, all right, now we know. Now we know what we need to know, let's do it. And he's like, whoa, slow down a little bit. So he's saying one of the difficulties that presently plagues American Indians is the assumption made by educated non-Indians that objective knowledge of something totally describes it. So I want us to come to this from a place of humility that this is a lifelong pursuit for people. If you're honestly trying to get to know history, honestly trying to get to know another people, it's not a crash course. That doesn't work very well. And so misunderstandings abound. And he talks about people that look like us being frantic to discover a means of establishing roots, discover an easy formula, and what he's saying here, no easy formulas, folks. This is hard work. And I just thought that would be a useful caution for us to think on as we continue to embark. So, I've got a couple things. David, where did David go?
Me?
Do you want to hand these out? Well,
Sorry. Any David can get up and do it.
I just wanted to throw a couple things out this morning of things I've heard of, and I know from conversations that some of you know what other people have done for reparations or engaging with this kind of stuff, so bring it on. The first one is the handout that David is putting, the two-sided thing, focusing on language and focusing on that educational side of the story. As I alluded to last week, and maybe I can't remember if I said this live in the group or offline beforehand, Martin Case, who wrote The Relentless Business of Treaty, says every Minnesotan speaks Dakota, just not always very well. All of these place names that you were probably familiar with are Dakota names. They've been transmogrified and anglicized and what have you, but we live with bits and pieces of the Dakota language. And then in recent years, I think many of you have noticed, the Dakota language is kind of making a resurgence in the popular understanding non-anglicized. So Bde-Makaska replaced Lake Calhoun finally, just across town. The project I'm going to talk about is Hahawakbadan, which is a feeder into Owamni, which is St. Anthony Falls as we know it today. So Valley Community Presbyterian Church up in Golden Valley, they embarked on a land acknowledgement process, and they got the message that land acknowledgement may be an okay first step, but it's only a step, and if you only say, we acknowledge that we're on Dakota homeland and then move on, that's not very respectful, it's not very helpful, frankly. So they said, what else can we do? What can we do to continue to get in relationship with Dakota people to meaningfully improve this world we're living in? So they got a legacy grant and hired Dr. Casey Keeler. She's a professor over at UW-Madison, and embarked on an oral history project. And the handout tells you a little bit more about that. On the backside, you can see who the participants were. Dr. Keeler has a really interesting focus of her academic research. She grew up in the suburbs, and she was scanning the academic world and said, nobody talks about the Indians that live in the suburbs, but we're here too. And so the focus of this project, being in Golden Valley, was do oral histories of Native folks who grew up in or live in the suburbs, and that perspective. They tied it to Hahawakbadan, which is the Dakota word for what we call Bassett's Creek. And Bassett's Creek runs through Golden Valley, 7 or 8 other suburbs, and opens out into the Mississippi River over by St. Anthony Falls. Went through a year-long project collecting these oral histories, having conversations, having community events, getting to know people, as I was talking about last week. And then how I got involved, they decided they've got all these oral histories, what are we going to do with them? And they give it to your friendly neighborhood history museum. So Hennepin History Museum is now, has now collected these oral histories. And the closing event for this project was bringing as many of the participants as were available back together and saying, what's next and what are we going to do? And there was a lot of energy around this name restoration. And so we've now gotten a grant with the St. Anthony Falls Heritage Board to do some programs to kind of enliven those oral histories, but also start the conversations up and down that creek about getting used to the name Hahawakbadan as opposed to Bassett's Creek. Getting used to the idea of, could we call it something else after all these years? And that's going to be a long process. If you follow Bde-Makaska, that became long and involved, and that was only one municipal entity, well, 2 if you count Park Board versus city. But this has got 7 municipalities, I don't have the number off the top of my head. They would all have to sign off on this and send it to the DNR. It would be complicated. But that doesn't mean it's not worth exploring and doing. Yes?
Who was Bassett?
Good question. Bassett was one of those guys.
That's the historian in John, right there.
I really don't remember the Bassett story, but he was one of those guys. Not a very influential or consequential guy, otherwise his first name would be off the top of my head, but no. Yeah. Let me just say as a follow-up, I would highly recommend if you can get your hands on it, there's a book about this thick called Minnesota Place Names, written by Warren Upham. I don't know if it's currently in print at MNHS, but if you can get your hands on an old one, it's awesome because Warren Upham answers that question and every other question you can imagine about where these place names came from. David?
Are you sure somebody didn't just name it after his Bassetown?
I'm pretty sure about that. I'm pretty sure about that. I remember it being like one of those guys, but yeah, not the panting guys. So let me before we go there, thoughts, reflections, reactions to this as an idea? So make you feel like, yeah, that's great, or a little cold, or what? Yeah, Judy.
Is that congregation thinking of going beyond names into things like reparations or not?
I don't know. I haven't talked to them about that.
Okay.
I do know that they're committed to continuing to do stuff, but I don't know if they've decided what that stuff is.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
I was involved in some oral history collecting of that sort up in Alaska. And this was a project run by the state. And the person in charge of it in a particular community where I was I think, a sociologist from the way she talked about things. And I learned during that session about several pitfalls involved. And one of them was quite striking because one of the members of a native tribe who was there talked a lot about a place called Forester Island, which was a place they used to love to hunt. But he always talked about it in the past tense. And eventually this person leading the project decided that this was a legendary island that didn't really exist, just because of the way they kept talking about it in the past tense. Well, that was wrong. If you looked at a map of the right part of Alaska, there was Forester Island. And if you looked at a sufficiently detailed map, you'd see it said Forester Island Federal Wildlife Refuge. That's why they couldn't go there anymore.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, oral history is a fascinating thing, and Native people got victimized a lot because the oral tradition was how they preserved their stories. And when Europeans came with pen and paper, they're like, it's not written down, it's not for real. I showed some slides last week about Jeffers petroglyphs, and the longstanding manager there, talking with elders over many, many years, concluded that done properly, that oral history process was as rigorous as a PhD program. And when you talk to traditional Native folks, many of the most authentic ones, in my opinion, will always start with, this is the way I've heard it, and if I am wrong, someone will correct me. And they've got this constant circular of, we're talking to each other and we're testing each other's stories and we're not making stuff up. So yeah, believe them when they talk about Forester Island, because there's a reality there someplace. You just need to figure out what that is. Yeah.
The thing I like about this project is that it's largely about building relationships and hearing stories. And I think that's a really fundamental place to start. And one thing I'd be interested in is what the Native people thought about this project. How did they understand it? How did they engage it? Did they appreciate it, or did they find some things difficult or offensive even about it? Do you know that piece of the story?
The people who participated appreciated it, enjoyed it. It helps when the crime investigator was Native herself. I believe she's Ho-Chunk. So she designed it with an aesthetic that would resonate with people. But I agree 100% with you. Relationships is a huge thing that I love about this project. The other is it underscores, without even saying it out loud, the message that so many people want us to hear, which is we're still here. And we are actively living in this community. And so the fact that this brought out voices that are not often heard. And if you look at the list, some of those folks have been well known in other ways, but they haven't been asked about, like, what about this part of your upbringing or this part of your life? What's it like to live in Plymouth, Minnesota as an Indigenous person? I think that they appreciated that fresh perspective on it.
Just an appreciation of the language, just based on a couple of place names that I know now. Dakota seems to be a very musical language. Once you know where to put the emphasis, you know, Pidemikaska, Mahawakvada. You know, it's just a lovely language.
Yeah, it really is.
So that's kind of fun too.
And
we get to say these fun words.
And it's an evocative language that, like, English has some of this too, but unlike Bassett's Creek, where like, yeah, that guy, I don't remember why it's called Bassett's Creek, but Wakpadon is a river, and, or no, Wakpadon is river, but it basically says this is a river, this is a creek going into the big river. And so it helps them, I mean, it actually makes sense, and you don't have to try to remember who that guy was. So.
Just a side note about the language, that the missionaries who decided to write the language down and translate the Bible and hymnals and so on, because they believed that that was how they could best convert, one of the ways they could convert people. But they approached the language as though it was a very simple language, because they thought these were very simple people. And over the years, they came to a great appreciation of the language, of the complexity of the language, of the nuances of the language. And there's a lot of correspondence among the missionaries trying to figure out what's the best Dakota word to use in place of this English word in the Bible, because it was so complicated that it was really a challenge for them. So it was part of what brought them to a new appreciation of the Dakota people themselves, that because the language, of course, reflects us, those of us who speak it. So.
Okay, does anybody need any more? I've got more copies now. If anybody needs.
I could use them.
All right, some other examples. Holy Trinity over in Longfellow, but along 31st. They made news last month. Yeah, it's still February, so it's still last month. They found themselves with $250,000 extra dollars, and they gave it to the Indian Land Tenure Foundation to buy back land for Native people. However they want to use it. That was the only there was no restriction. They just said Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which is a foundation meant to explore Indian lands. They said, do with it as you wish, and Indian Land Tenure said, we think this is a really good seed money to start a land purchase fund. And so that's what they're going to do with it. I'm a little conflicted about this one. I love the idea of getting land back to tribes. I don't know anything about Holy Trinity, and if any of you do, please chime in. What makes me a little nervous about this one is, are you just buying yourself out of the problem? And I pulled a couple quotes out of the newspaper article. It makes me a little uncomfortable when they said, yeah, we received some unexpected profits from a land, so the money wasn't ours in the first place, so we thought we ought to give it back. It just doesn't feel like they had to work very hard for this one. And maybe that's okay. Maybe I'm just a little bit too Lutheran and like need to look for the grace.
They're not
But
gonna turn it down.
I mean, what I know about them is it's the place right across from the 3rd precinct. So they were a very involved place for the last few
yeah,
years,
and if you
but
look
I
on
don't
their
know where the money
website, they've
came
got
from, but
a
yeah.
strong commitment to justice and social justice and all that. So I don't want to trash on them, but I want to, like, if we fund ourselves with $250,000, what would we do with it?
I know what we do with it.
Yeah, I do too.
What would we do with it, Laura?
Yeah, Chandler and anybody on the vestry knows what we do
I
with
think,
it.
well, I think if we came in with that kind of money, we'd certainly want the congregation and the vestry to dream and come up with some uses for it. But we do have a mortgage.
Yeah.
And
Boring.
so, exactly, it is boring. So maybe not all, but certainly part.
Well, we've tithed, and we've often tithed in the past when we've had money to give away, so, yeah.
I don't know where to fill this in, but one of the tragedies of the forming of the ELC was that we lost the ALC headquarters here. And the ALC was doing a lot of creative things with the Native Americans. One of which was to bring a medicine man into the Phillips neighborhood, Elmer Renning, who was he was Episcopalian and a designated one of the 4 medicine men that the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs, said was authentic because he didn't use drugs. And he did some amazing, he would do some amazing healing ceremonies in the homes of Native Americans in Phillips neighborhood. And we were lucky enough to be part of it. Lutheran Social Service at that time had a chaplain also that worked a lot with the natives. And that man was James Frank. James Frank asked me to go with him when he went on a vision quest because he wanted to understand the spirituality of the. And I think we have to remember that Christ was with God from the beginning, okay? Christ was first incarnated in nature. Nature is first the expression of what God is like, you know? And so that's been going on for, what millions of years. So, and the natives understand that. They understand this, everything, all of nature has a spirit in it. And Elmer Renning understood that, and we went to, anyhow, I went on the vision quest for it, and I was struck because James Frank had to spend an hour on the top of a hill, 24 hours, and before he did, he fasted, and then he went through a sweat, and then he went up on the hill, and during the night, the elders, my son and I, prayed for him, and so they sang, and during the night, there was a thunderstorm. Well, during the thunderstorm, the elders looked at each other and they chuckled. They thought that was really funny because they saw the thunderstorm as a trickster, and they saw James Frank as kind of a trickster. He was. Anyhow, when he came back, we went up and brought him back, and escorted him back, and then of course, because he had sweated and hadn't eaten, he hallucinated. We would say he hallucinated. Well, they wanted to know what spirits he saw. And so he talked about what we would say is hallucination. But he described what he saw, and they looked at each other. Oh yeah, well they knew that spirit. And and then he told what, oh yes. And then they wanted to know what animal showed up. And so, well, there was this crow. Well, describe the crow. Well, they knew that crow. And I was struck with the fact that they did know. I mean, they knew the spirit of, like our ancestors probably knew in Europe, the spirit of the land. And so, why we didn't listen to their understanding of nature, which would have really informed us, which is really,
And is it
it's
too late?
Christ,
Yeah.
it's Christ, it's Christ. Christ is not Jesus' last name. Jesus is the Christ. And we don't have that. Our theology could have been expanded by listening to them.
Yeah, listening is a good skill. Don?
You know, if you remember Tent City,
Yep.
they were all the homeless were. I met with a developer over there, Native American. He's a millionaire, and he's done an awful lot building housing for the homeless. And I even have pictures on my phone of what he's developed over there in place of that. Very active in working with the mayor of Minneapolis in housing for the homeless. And I'm talking, it's not just a couple of units, but we're talking in the thousands, which has really reduced the homeless population just down the street and
Right.
a lot of places here. So that's my particular passion, that people that are homeless need to have a place to live.
Yeah,
And when you don't have a place to live, you don't have a place to live, except where you are.
yeah, so and I think that's an exciting avenue to think about is, does he have it covered, or is there a place we could help? To me, I think there's a nice symmetry to, we're talking about Dakota homeland and we're talking about giving people homes. I think there's some,
That whole development in that area is Native American.
yeah, the Little Earth settlement, yeah.
Getting a little closer to the question that you originally asked about where Mount Olive goes in this processing. It seems to me that the place to not start is a land use statement because it often ends up stopping there.
Mhm.
And it's again informed by a lot of reading, the objective information that was listed in that first comment that you put up on the screen. We know a lot about natives, but we don't know any natives.
Right, get to know them.
And it would seem to me that a better way would be to strike a relationship with organizations or individuals, active groups that we could learn from. I knew much less about Afghanistan and the troubles of their lives before we met this family and started to get to know them as individuals and so on. It informed a lot of the news that I hear of them. So it seems to be that the place to start is through forming relationships, trying to find places that, as Don is suggesting, you know,
Yep.
participating in housing, which is such a fundamental, or nutrition, another fundamental.
So,
you know,
Art,
things like that, sorry.
did you hack into my computer last night? 'Cause
Whoa,
how do we go backwards?
I
Sorry.
try to hack into everybody's computer.
This is last week, going very fast.
Because I don't know anything.
There we go. Yes.
He's talking about building relationships. We can start right here in our community, the Native American church, about 3 blocks away.
She's been hacking too.
She's been hacking too. So I know enough to be dangerous because I just went on their website and I see some interesting parallels. They were formed in the mid-70s, which was right at the time when the federal government finally said to Native people, okay, you can practice your own religion again. It was illegal until 1978 for them to do this. But at the same time, this Catholic Church formed as a way to express spirituality, pan-tribal. I think it's both Dakota and Ojibwe. I've never gone down the block to get to know these folks. Has anybody ever had interaction, and what was it? And tell us more about this congregation that's a block away from us.
I know they have a really cool Easter vigil because they start outside
Uh-huh.
with a bonfire.
When Anna was here, and I don't think Jim, is Jim here today?
No, he's not.
Yeah, Anna did establish a relationship there, and that's been a while. I don't know if anyone remember that conversation. Just kind of opened the door and, you know, obviously we didn't continue to nurture that, but I think it was incredible.
Yeah, Irene.
Someone was saying how we're not in tune with our neighbors, or Native American and other people of color. Some time ago, it was a few years back, because we were still even having the meal. I was taking someone to home from here after lunch, and the person that said, "What kind of church is that?" And I said, "Oh, that's the Native American church." And she said to me, "They worship inside a church?" And I'm like, well, where do you think they worship?" Well, I just kind of, you know. And
Yeah.
I was just like blown away. I just didn't even know what else, what to
sometimes you just gotta let that go. David?
Well, that sparked my thought, that last week I made that crack about growing up, and what really I meant by that was, we still talk in terms of we, they, and I would love to get to the maturity where we just understand we as we, and that might start with us learning, we want to deal with this issue in a way that Europeans typically would. Here's some money, here's a house, here's some more things. And from what I've learned, which is not that much, that those things are, it doesn't make sense to them. Owning land is not a part of anything they've ever known. And so to give them land, so what we're really dealing with is a huge challenge of radically two different economics and how one lives life where they are and with what.
And let me just say,
I don't know what the answer is.
And I don't want to speak for Kate Bean, because that's a dangerous thing. Kate Bean is now the director of Minnesota Museum of Art. She was one of the main movers and shakers that got the Dei Makaska restored. And I hear what you're saying, David, and the traditional, as we talked about last week, the traditional view of property is very different than the European one. And yet, I saw Kate on Facebook a few months ago, like, she finally got her house. And that was important to her. So they're part of this world and community, and it's complicated.
Well, maybe we could start by saying, yeah, okay, we own the deed and the mortgage to go with it, but maybe we don't have to be so proprietous about it. That we make it available to all of us with a broader understanding of who we are.
Is it expanding our use of this property?
But we build forts, or that keep the world out instead of just letting everything be wide open and usable.
I think you've been trying to get a word in.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of piggyback on that. I think it is important for us to be careful about this relationship thing, because white people often go around saying, I need black friends, and I need to learn, so you need to be my friend. And we've got a lot of work to do, to your point about how we talk about even our own neighborhood in this church. And, I see a lot of things on the website and hear, well, it's safe, and, people who live here, that does not sound good to hear. And so I think, there's work we could do, and to that end, I think it's also maybe important for us to understand that, to the we versus they point, we have, in our own traditions that were much more respectful of the land and had different philosophies, that over the years, the patriarchal church has made into heresies. And so I think that even within our own tradition, if we do some work on that and on ourselves, and kind of thinking about how we see our own tradition and we see our own cultures, and what are our indigenous white cultures, that we have those too, before we enter and try to learn everything from another population. So I don't know how you go about that. And education is part of it. We're doing it here, and there was the whiteness stuff that you guys did, which is fantastic. So I think as part of that, how do you know when it's the time for us to go outside and ask someone else to be in a relationship with us? I think that's just I'd hate to see us jump to relationship, just like I hate to see us jump to giving away land.
I mean, if I can talk about this reminds me, I didn't introduce myself last week because I figured people know me, but I'm currently director of the Hennepin History Museum, which is over in the Whittier neighborhood. And that museum has no relationship with Native folks, and they haven't as far back as I can figure out. And there's some impatience for us to get busy doing that stuff, and I've been very reluctant because I know that Native people have got their own agendas and their own things to do, and everybody wants a piece of them.
That's right.
So it's no accident that the Valley Community Church Project fell in my lap. It's like, all right, here's something I can work with. They got some Native voices that were willing to work on this project, and they're willing to keep talking. All right, let's see where it can go. Let's get another grant. And because I want it to be on an equal terms of, it's not just about me and our organization's needs, it's about what's in it for you, and is it worth your time, frankly, to talk to us? Because they've got a lot of better things to do, potentially.
Well, in our enthusiasm, we don't want to like think, oh, we have to get something done like right now. We have time.
Yeah.
And not make time like we view time as something different.
Right.
We can't go in and tell them what we're gonna do.
Yeah, that doesn't
Like
work.
we want,
It does not work.
You know, Richfield High School, the Richfield School District decided to have a land acknowledgement statement, and it took a while. And I'm still not convinced that it's like, okay, so now what?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's right. What I didn't mean to say is that not all has to find a thing to do. We probably need to find many things. So Don has a passion for housing and has been participating in that back since the days of the encampment. That's one way. Many people have kids in school where they form possible friendships with Native people. That's another way to connect family to family or kids to kids. So there's probably a mini, it's more of an internal gut change than it is a focused program.
Yeah,
So I wasn't
and taking
trying to
advantage
say
of
that.
the power of a congregation is, like, to your point, we don't have to just do one thing or here, and like, we can spread our power around because this is a decentralized place that can do a lot of stuff. Yeah.
I think, just jumping here quickly, you were throwing around the word relationship. And, you know, in our own minds, I've been in this room, there's all kinds of definitions of relationship. And we're looking at a relationship now with a culture. How does that culture define the word relationship? What are the components that make up that relationship? Do we know what components are in that? Because if we're throwing out our own definition of what a relationship means, you know, we're friendly, we talk, we don't throw things to each other, you know, whatever. But is there some, and I don't want to make it into some kind of mysterious thing at all, but ask the serious question, how does a Native person understand a relationship?
And I'll throw back at you, if you sensed 5 different definitions of relationship in this room, there's at least 5 in Native communities too. So it's like you gotta talk to the people and everybody's gonna have their own perspective.
And that's what, kind of the essence of my question. Have we talked enough to them to even understand that, where to go?
Yeah. So.
I think in your first description of this congregation.
I'm sorry?
In your first description
Yeah.
of the congregation that's near us, you mentioned that it was a congregation of both Dakota and Ojibwa. I would be very interested in finding out how well that's working and if they've made it work. That's quite an accomplishment. I was fairly involved in Indian issues around here back in the 1970s. And at that time, well, this organization I was a member of had both Dakota and Ojibwa Indians within its membership. They didn't get along too well.
Oh, interesting.
They're traditional enemies. They have been for centuries.
Yeah, you'll get a lot of bristle if you say that out loud in a room with them. Because I think they've come to understand they have a lot more in common than apart.
Well,
and they've come to understand that their enmity was often driven by a third party in the space.
Yes.
So I haven't observed that kind of conflict in my experience the last 20-some years, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist under the surface.
And if they really have effectively dealt with it, that's something we could learn from them about conflict resolution.
Yeah. I thought you were jumping up. Go ahead.
So, one of the things that I think I keep just coming back to in these conversations about relationship and doing stuff is the whole idea of education. And despite, maybe the Ron DeSantis version of what education is, I think it's great when we enter into communities that are not our own and we say we want to have a relationship with them, whether that's authentic or whether it's just kind of like you realize that's just the way the world's going. But I think that we have to be careful about asking those communities to educate us. Like I just like, after, almost 54 years, I'm really tired of trying to teach people about what life is like as a queer person. I'm just sick of it, right? Because it's not, it's like, men's job to fix misogyny, it's straight people's job to fix homophobia, it's white people's job to fix racism, you know, and I think that it's really important for all of us to like breathe and say, how many of us have taken the time to just read a ton of books about what has really happened here? Here, you know, at this very spot, or here in the, you know, in the larger community, here in this country, you know, and I think that that's just like a really great place to start before we even enter into the sort of idea of relationship. Let's go into relationship, whatever that looks like, with just a really solid understanding of what's happened. And I think that that's one of the things that sometimes we forget to do, is to just educate ourselves.
I'd like to piggyback on what was just said. I think before relationships can be rebuilt, we have to confront the evil within ourselves and what we've contributed to what has happened in the past. And I think that confrontation needs to be an important preliminary step.
Yes, good. You wanted to jump in again? Oh.
Well, I just wanted to piggyback too on what
Yeah.
she said. I mean, that was what I was trying to say, so thank you for saying it better. I can overcomplicate my contributions very easily. But in addition to books, podcasts, documentaries, I mean, all this material is out there, and I think what that does for us is that when we then enter relationships, we're not asking those stupid questions like, who's the guy and who's the gal in your relationship, or whatever it might be, you know, that because we've learned, and that stuff happens all the time. It's called microaggressions, right?
Yep.
Yes. And so if we don't educate ourselves before we enter a relationship, then we're going to do that.
This seems like, sorry, the one thing, Chandler. This seems like a good time to say, I passed out a bibliography. It should go without saying, this is not a comprehensive bibliography. This is some of the things that informed what I talked about last week, some of the things that I just found quickly over the last few weeks. If you read any of the books on that list, it'll have a bibliography behind where it gives you 25 more books to read. If you start exploring some of those websites, you can go as deep as you want to go. So that's a starter, not a finisher. I just wanted to say that out loud.
I read that.
I didn't say, this is a start, not a finish, but yeah.
I was just going to say, I read everything you wanted to know about Indians. It's a really good book to start with because it is quick to read, and it does kind of bring you down to a really good.
And Anton Troyer has just a really nice style of using humor to cut through what a lot of people just have hang-ups by. He's like, chill out.
I thought so too. So that kind of maybe cuts through some of the insecurity or like we have in asking questions or
like, so, I don't know, this is just a funny anecdote, I don't know if it advances the conversation, but I heard Anton Troyer speak a few years ago, and he was talking about his freshman year at Dartmouth. He was fresh off the reservation up at White Earth. He was feeling homesick and lonely like freshmen do, and he saw on a message board for a sweat out in the woods outside of Dartmouth. He's like, oh, great, I'm gonna go do this, I'm gonna connect with some folks. As he was driving out, he started to have second thoughts. Should I do this? All right, well, I'm already in the car. Let's go and finish. He came to this clearing in the woods, and there are a bunch of naked hippies hanging around in this clearing. And one of them came up and gave him this huge bear hug. I'm so sorry what we did to your people. He's like, could you put some clothes on and maybe we could chat? So, you know, it's like, let's not be weird. And I think that those kind of experiences caused him to write that book of, like, white people, chill out. And let me just cut through some of the stuff. Chandler, you've been waiting patiently.
Oh, yeah, no, that's a great story. And it kind of leads into what I wanted to say, and that is that we are in community with that congregation, whether we spend time with them or not. We're here. We're all in the same city. I spent a month in Italy back in my youth, and it was this little town called Urbania, and it was, and at night, you know, after, you know, in the evening after work, everyone came to the town square, young and old, boys and girls, and they just hung out. It was where everyone came after the day, and I think, piggybacking on what David was saying about access, it really, I think being in community with one another is extending invitations and having spaces to just gather and meet and talk about nothing important.
Yeah.
You know, like it's,
A good first step with
100%.
I'm not even gonna try to pronounce. I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Would be
Yeah.
like, hey, let's chat. What's it like on 31st?
Yeah.
On your end of the block.
Yeah.
Like, just
yeah,
what's going on?
yeah, because I just, but yeah, anyway, that's what I.
I think another thing in that Vine Deloria article that I sent you, I'm taking a class at St. Olaf right now on Native American spirituality, and what he talks about is, you know, non-Indians educated non-Indians, that's kind of a word a phrase he uses a lot, who come to Native people, like, I mean, the story that you told reminds me of this, who come to Native people looking for what they can't find in the world.
Yeah.
This connection to the land, a sort of spirituality that they just a hunger for, you know, and of course he says, you know, that it's not helpful because Native spirituality is like Christian spirituality. It's been formed out of centuries of thought and lifetimes of experience. And so I think we have to be, I don't know, I think maybe we have to understand our own spirituality really well and take a look at that. And I think, though, that there are touch points. There are touch points where we can learn perhaps from one another. But I think it's a cautious, it needs to be a cautious journey, and we need to be really aware of the possible missteps, but also aware of the grace and the forgiveness too.
Yeah. So I'm aware of the time. I've heard, I think Laura, you told me Our Savior's does that tithe that you mentioned. Are there any other, like, should we be talking with Our Savior's or Calvary, or does anybody know of work they're already doing in these
Well, I
areas?
talked to Our Savior. I left a message for the pastor, didn't hear back. All I know is what Joseph told me that he had heard is that Our Savior's has decided to make a budgetary line item so that it's an ongoing thing. It's just not a one-time thing. But I don't know who they are working with or what project they're engaged in.
So
we do have a member of our congregation, Sylvia Thompson. Those of you who used to be involved with our church here and with the Children's Clothing Closet. She was Native American family. Part of the Native, she also was a member of the church on 31st and Stark, and her funeral was there, and her many children would come here. They would come here for Easter and Christmas. Unfortunately, many of these young children died early deaths, and there's one remaining son he had who I see from time to time, but he would come to our church, so he was a member there and a member here. I mean, he would come to the church. They kind of considered it one of their churches.
Great. Well, as I'd hoped, you all jumped like to the end in a better way than I could have imagined, so I appreciate that. These were just some questions that occurred to me that I think would be useful for us to keep thinking about. I think keying off of not going to other people and asking what they can do for us is to think about what we're good at and what we're interested in, like where does our journey take us in terms of learning and what have you, and what can we offer to the world? Not like, it's good to find out what people need, but it's also good to know authentically what we can do. So I think I've heard a lot of good questions today, and we've got 5 minutes. Any other responses to these questions or the questions and comments that have been raised? I think it's all good. A process thing, David was taking some notes of some of the highlights that came out. I know he's planning to record and share these kind of PowerPoints, these kind of questions, and it's going to be an ongoing conversation over months and years, I would guess. Chandler, do you have anything more you wanted to say? you started this all 2 weeks, or last week, but like, do you want to say about what the vestry is hoping for in terms of where we go from here?
I don't know. I think, I think the vestry has started a conversation about how do we acknowledge some of these wounds, as a Christian congregation, and how do we step into that space responsibly? And so and I don't think that's been revealed to us. I think all of the questions and all of the things that we've talked about during this are the things that we still need to consider. And there are resources within the ELCA that can help us with something like a land acknowledgement and to start that process. But to Ted's point with the Richfield School District as an example, the time it would take to do that responsibly is probably going to be quite extended. So I would say that those things have not been revealed to the vestry yet, but we are in conversation about them, and we will continue to talk about them because it's relevant to where we are and what we're doing.
And presumably the vestry, working on our behalf, will respond to what energy we as a congregation are bringing to it, right?
Absolutely, and like working on your behalf, but also working with you. Like the efforts of the vestry do not succeed without the combined efforts of the people in the congregation. And so, absolutely, yeah.
Just another question I had is, I'm stealing someone else's point who maybe didn't want to say it, but there are so many of these, I guess for lack of a better word, oppression by the dominant culture. We have gender issues within this congregation that we still enact every day. We have Native American, we have African American. And so I'm really interested in how do we engage in a discussion, maybe what's our strengths and interests, which issue can we become maybe more, so we're just not drifting around saying, now we're interested in this oppression, now we're interested in that one. And maybe that's okay, I don't know, but that's just a question I have. Like, what's the process for really looking at the full slate of things that we could be getting engaged in, and where might we have some expertise or some strengths?
One of the beauties of this congregation is that when we start asking questions like this, like all of a sudden people come to mind. Like, oh, I know someone who could lead us through this discussion, or someone who does this as their work. It's part of what they do professionally, and so we do have people that can help facilitate these kinds of conversations, and we can organize something where the congregation, members of the congregation can come and we can wrestle with ideas and come up with direction. Yeah. But that's a great point, is that it does need focused effort. Yeah.
Well, I think that circles back to the earlier comments about learning ourselves and where we come from and how to break down those rigidities of thought and reaction. Once we start learning how to honor where we come from, but be open to learning about others and start learning about others, that I think starts to generate a pattern of thought and behavior that applies across multiple relationships.
Yeah.
We don't need a separate approach for different groups. It's all one approach in terms of learning and being open and learning how to get into relationships.
Yeah. Are you taking the last word, Don?
Yeah. The Native Americans are better at changing what they need than we are thinking we can change what they need. When they tore apart Tent City, it was in 20 lawyers from the reservation up north that came down. I offered to help them. I didn't last 20 minutes. they went at that and disassembled it. The police couldn't do it. They were backup if there was any violence. But it took the Native Americans to disassemble that and move people into the transition unit that they had built.
Yeah.
So if we think that we can change and provide a miracle for these people, I think we're confused.
Yeah, the whole white savior thing is fraught with all sorts of problems. I was talking with a Seward history group a few weeks ago, and they were telling me that in 2020, the AIM patrols were reinstated, and that's probably who you're talking about. The police fell apart as a viable thing in 2020, but American Indian Movement said, all right, it's time for us to get busy again. We're going to protect our neighborhood, because nobody else is going to, so.
The best story to come out of that situation, it was really kind of emblematic of the differences in cultures, was when the AIM patrol caught those teenagers breaking into the liquor store. They had driven up to the Twin Cities to rob some liquor stores in the middle of a riot. I mean, what were they thinking? But their approach was to call their mothers.
Yep.
Make them call their mothers.
Let's do some restorative justice here.
You know, our cops would have treated that a whole different way.
Yeah.
And I just hang on to that anecdote as really telling.
Yeah.